Imagine a racetrack with no straightaways. For an entire lap, you just turned left. Now make that
McElreath pulls in behind Foyt, and they both prepare to stand on it for the first dirt race of the 1964 season. 20,000 fans and 17 drivers anticipate the start.
One section became so violent that drivers gave it a name: Puke Hollow. This was Langhorne Speedway. It hosted NASCAR, IndyCar, modifieds, motorcycles, and some of the greatest drivers in American racing history, and it developed a reputation as one of the most terrifying racetracks ever built. Langhorne Speedway opened in Pennsylvania in 1926, and its original layout was unlike almost anything we'd consider a normal racetrack today. It was a 1-mile dirt track, shaped almost in a perfect circle. There wasn't a traditional front stretch, back stretch, and 4 distinct corners. Once you started turning left, you basically didn't stop until the lap was over. And that's why drivers called Langhorne the Big Left Turn. And this wasn't some slow local dirt track. Langhorne attracted some of the biggest names in American motorsports. NASCAR raced there, Champ Cars raced there, and eventually drivers like A.J. Foyt, Mario Andretti, Pernelli Jones, and the Usner brothers would all take on Langhorne. But the track had a serious problem: its surface. As cars raced around the dirt mile, the track would deteriorate. Ruts and holes developed in the racing surface, and one section was particularly brutal: Puke Hollow. As the race went on, Puke Hollow could turn into a massive washboard. Cars would bounce violently through the ruts, while drivers fought desperately to keep themselves under control. And because Langhorne was dirt, there was another problem: dust. Imagine following another car at more than 100 miles per hour while being pelted with dirt and barely being able to see what's ahead of you, without being able to water the track every few minutes like local dirt tracks. Now imagine doing that without the modern fire suits, without a Hans device, without safer barriers, and with race cars built decades before modern safety standards. And in 1951, all of those dangers came together. That year, Langhorne held its first National Open. This wasn't some small local race. The National Open was designed to bring together some of the best modified and sportsman racers in the country. And near the end of the race, Langhorne showed exactly why it had become so feared. On lap 83, there was a massive crash. Cars piled into one another until the track was essentially blocked. And then, a fire started. Flames erupted from the wreckage as drivers tried to escape. Smoke poured across the speedway, and multiple drivers were injured. And among the drivers caught in the disaster was Wally Campbell. Campbell wasn't just another competitor. He was the 1951 NASCAR National Modified Champion, and he suffered serious burns in this wreck. The scheduled 100-lap race couldn't even be completed. It was stopped after just 83 laps, and somehow this footage of the race still survives today. You can see the cars, the fire, and then look at what they're wearing. There is no modern fireproof racing suits, no full-face helmet like you'd see today, no Hans device, no safer barrier waiting to absorb the impact like at NASCAR tracks. These guys were basically sitting inside metal race cars surrounded by fuel. And this was happening on a dusty 1-mile track where drivers sometimes couldn't even see the accident until they were already in it. But somehow, the 1951 National Open wasn't even Langhorne's most infamous tragedy. 9 years later, one of the greatest drivers in America came to Langhorne: Jimmy Bryan. Bryan wasn't an inexperienced driver trying to prove himself. He was one of the best. He had won 3 national championships, and in 1958, Jimmy Bryan won the Indy 500. After that victory, Bryan largely stepped away from racing. But in 1960, an opportunity came up for him to race at Langhorne. Another Indy 500 winner, Roger Ward, reportedly wanted to be part of the race, but Bryan took the ride instead. The conditions were brutal. Temperatures reportedly reached over 106 degrees. But Bryan was still fast. He qualified on the outside of the front row, and then the race started. On the very first lap, Jimmy Bryan entered Puke Hollow. His car got sideways, caught one of Langhorne's enormous ruts, and he was launched into the air. The car reportedly traveled about 55 feet down the track before violently coming back down. Other drivers raced underneath and around the flipping car. Jimmy Bryan was tragically killed. He was just 34 years old. Think about what that meant to the other racers. This wasn't some rookie who had gotten in over his head. This was an Indy 500 winner, a 3-time national champion, and one of America's best dirt track racers, and Langhorne had killed him on the first lap. If Langhorne could do that to Jimmy Bryan, it could do it to anybody. And unfortunately, Bryan wasn't the last. In 1962, Hugh Campbell was killed in another accident at Puke Hollow. Then, in 1963, Mario Andretti was standing near that same section of the racetrack during a sprint car race. He watched Bobby Marvin hit the guardrail and flip repeatedly and die in a fire. A year later, Mario Andretti himself was preparing to make his Champ Car debut, and of all places, it was at Langhorne Speedway. Think about who we're talking about here. Mario Andretti would eventually win the Indy 500, the Daytona 500, and become a Formula One world champion. He would race at places like Monaco, Indy, and Daytona, yet Andretti later remembered his first Langhorne race as the only race in his career that he was genuinely worried about beforehand. He said he barely slept the night before, and once he actually raced there, Langhorne physically tore him up. Without power steering, Andretti had to constantly fight the steering wheel around the 1 mile circle. By the end of the race, his hands were covered in blisters. But that was Langhorne. It didn't punish mistakes. It punished you simply for driving around it. And NASCAR knew all about this place. When NASCAR launched its strictly stock division in 1949, the series that eventually became the Cup Series, Langhorne was on the schedule. In fact, it hosted only the 4th race in the history of NASCAR's top division. Curtis Turner, who I also did a video on, ended up winning it. NASCAR continued to come back. From 1949 through 1957, the Cup Series raced at Langhorne 17 times. Herb Thomas won here 3 times. Paul Goldsmith won here in 1956 and later described it as incredibly difficult in both motorcycles and stock cars. At one point, he was leading a stock car race when the rough surface reportedly shook the fuel tank right out of his car. That's how violent the ruts could be at this track. Eventually, though, something had to change. Before the 1965 season, Langhorne was transformed. The legendary dirt surface was paved, and the near-perfect circle was reconfigured into more of a D-shaped layout. More importantly, Puke Hollow was essentially gone. Without the deteriorating dirt surface, those enormous ruts couldn't develop the same way. You'd think that would finally make Langhorne somewhat safe. But there was a new problem, and that was speed. The cars became much faster. On pavement, when something went wrong, the drivers had even less room for air due to the speed. By Langhorne's final Champ Car race in 1970, Bobby Unser qualified at an average speed of more than 129 miles per hour around Langhorne. And fittingly, the final battle for that race involved him trying to chase down his younger brother, Al. Bobby knew there was only one place he could essentially make the pass, and that area used to be Puke Hollow. He went for it, and somehow it worked. But at this point, Langhorne's days were numbered. The track held its final race in October of 1971. After 45 years of racing, the big left turn was finished. The property was eventually redeveloped, and today, if you didn't know the history of the area, you could pass right by without realizing that one of America's most infamous racetracks once stood here. But Langhorne left behind an incredible legacy. NASCAR raced here during its earliest years. It had some of America's greatest drivers compete there, like A.J. Foyt, Mario Andretti, Parnelli Jones, and Jimmy Bryan. The generations of modified racers who made the National Open one of the biggest events of its kind. But it also left behind something darker. Crashes, fires, and drivers who never made it home. And a section of the racetrack so brutal that it earned the name Puke Hollow. There's a reason Langhorne became known as the track that ate heroes. And when you watch the footage from the 1951 National Open, it's not hard to understand why. If you want to hear more stories about the forgotten and dangerous and completely insane parts of racing history, please subscribe.